Over the English Channel on August 15, 1940, at precisely 11,000 feet, Sergeant Michael Henshaw crouched behind his twin Browning machine guns in the rear turret of a Royal Air Force bomber, watching a formation of 12 German fighters climbing toward them through scattered clouds. The sun glinted off their wings as they closed the distance with mechanical precision. Henshaw felt his heart hammering against his ribs, his palms slick with sweat inside his leather gloves. Every manual, every briefing, every veteran he had spoken to had taught him the same doctrine. Conserve ammunition, fire in controlled bursts, wait until the enemy is within 300 yards. He gripped the gun handles tighter, preparing to follow the rules that had been drilled into him since training. What neither he nor the approaching German pilots could possibly know was that in the next 4 minutes, those rules would be shattered forever, and 12 experienced aviators would meet their end, not through superior skill or better aircraft, but because one terrified gunner was about to do something so reckless, so counterintuitive, that it would fundamentally transform aerial combat doctrine for every air force in the world. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the true account of how desperation, mathematics, and a complete abandonment of conventional wisdom gave birth to what military historians would later call the most significant tactical innovation in defensive aerial gunnery of the entire Second World War. The summer of 1940 marked a critical period. The German Air Force had achieved stunning victories across Europe, their pilots honed by years of combat experience. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters represented the cutting edge of aerial engineering, reaching speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour. German pilots flew them with the confidence of men who had rarely tasted defeat. The statistics told a grim story for Royal Air Force bomber crews. In July of 1940 alone, Bomber Command had lost 147 aircraft. Of these, 93 had fallen to fighter attacks. Most rear gunners lasted an average of just 5 operational missions before being taken down, captured, or severely wounded. Michael Henshaw understood these odds. The 23-year-old from Manchester had joined the RAF in 1938. By August 1940, he had completed 3 operational missions, each one leaving him convinced that standard defensive tactics were flawed. The doctrine of fire discipline made perfect sense on paper. Ammunition was heavy, each round weighing approximately 24 grams. A typical bomber carried only 2,500 rounds per gun, translating to roughly 30 seconds of continuous fire. But Henshaw had noticed something during his missions. Every time he followed the doctrine, waiting until German fighters were within the prescribed 300-yard range, he found himself reacting rather than disrupting their attacks. More importantly, German pilots seemed to time their attacks based on the same assumptions about British fire discipline. Flight Lieutenant Robert Chen, the pilot of Henshaw's Vickers Wellington bomber that August morning, had noticed his gunner's tension during the pre-flight briefing. Chen, a Cambridge mathematics graduate, had developed a reputation for encouraging unconventional thinking. Henshaw had approached him with an idea that bordered on madness. The proposal was simple but radical. Instead of waiting for enemy fighters to close to standard engagement range, Henshaw wanted to open fire at maximum distance, creating a wall of tracer fire that would force attacking aircraft to fly through a psychological barrier. While the probability of hitting a target at 800 to 1,000 yards was low, the effect on enemy pilot decision-making could be profound. Chen had listened carefully. What if the goal was not to hit the enemy, but to force them into making mistakes? What if the psychological impact of sustained fire outweighed the mathematical inefficiency? The Germans had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm of combat. Disrupting that rhythm might create opportunities that perfect accuracy never could. Navigator Peter Morrison, a former schoolteacher from Edinburgh, had added an observation. He had tracked the timing of fighter attacks and noted that German pilots typically committed to their attack runs approximately 15 seconds before opening fire, at roughly 800 yards. If defensive fire could disrupt this commitment phase, it might force pilots to abort earlier. As the Wellington bomber droned across the Channel that morning, carrying a load of 500-pound bombs intended for targets in occupied France, Henshaw ran through the calculations one more time. Each of his twin Browning .303 machine guns had a theoretical maximum effective range of approximately 2,000 yards, though the manual specified engagement ranges of no more than 400 yards for any reasonable hit probability. The guns could fire at a rate of 1,150 rounds per minute when both were firing simultaneously. If he opened fire at 800 yards and maintained continuous fire until the enemy either broke off or closed to 200 yards, he would expend roughly half his total ammunition. This left enough for a second engagement if necessary, but there would be no margin for error, no reserve for extended combat. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the early mist and leaving the sky a brilliant, dangerous blue. The Wellington was part of a small formation of 6 bombers, flying in a loose defensive pattern that allowed each aircraft's gunners to provide overlapping fields of fire. But experience had taught every crew that formations offered only psychological comfort. When German fighters struck, they came fast and from multiple angles, and each bomber ultimately fought its own desperate battle for survival. Henshaw saw them first. A formation of what he estimated as 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters climbing through broken clouds at roughly 7,000 feet, vectoring to intercept the bomber formation from below and behind. The classic attack position. He keyed his intercom, his voice steady despite the fear that made his hands tremble. He told Chen that they had company. 12 fighters climbing to attack position, approximately 4 miles out and closing fast. Chen acknowledged, then asked Henshaw directly if he was committed to trying his unorthodox tactic. The pilot's voice carried no judgment, only the calm pragmatism of a man who understood that survival often depended on adaptation rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. Henshaw confirmed that he was ready. Chen then made a decision that would be analyzed in military academies for decades afterward. He authorized Henshaw to engage at his discretion and instructed the rest of the crew to support the gunner's judgment, regardless of what the manual said. The German fighters climbed with the beautiful, terrible efficiency that had made them masters of European skies. Flying in loose pairs, they would likely split into 2 attack groups, one engaging from the rear quarter, while the other made high side passes. This was standard Luftwaffe tactical doctrine, refined through hundreds of engagements. The pilots flying those aircraft were not novices. Many had 10 or more confirmed victories. They approached the British formation with the confidence of predators who had never encountered prey, that fought back in unexpected ways. At approximately 1,000 yards, Henshaw made his decision. He pressed both triggers and felt the twin Brownings roar to life, their combined rate of fire creating a sustained hammer of noise that vibrated through the entire aircraft. Tracers arced out into the morning sky, 1 round in every 5 glowing bright orange as it burned through the air. From the perspective of the approaching German pilots, the effect must have been startling. Instead of the expected silence as they closed to attack range, they suddenly faced streams of tracer fire, reaching out toward them like glowing tentacles, appearing much earlier than their experience and training had led them to expect. The physics of aerial gunnery at extreme range worked against accuracy in every measurable way. The .303 round left the barrel at approximately 2,600 feet per second, but air resistance degraded both velocity and trajectory over distance. At 800 yards, the bullet drop was measured in feet, and the time of flight meant that hitting a maneuvering target required leading the aim point by impossible to calculate margins. Every instructor, every manual, every experienced gunner would have told Henshaw that what he was doing was wasteful at best, catastrophic at worst. But the tracers created an effect that transcended simple ballistics. The human eye is drawn to movement, to light, to threat. The German pilots, expecting to press their attacks to 300 or 400 yards before facing defensive fire, suddenly found themselves flying toward what appeared to be an impenetrable wall of glowing ammunition. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The lead pair of fighters broke their attack run at 600 yards, peeling away in opposite directions to reassess their approach. This alone was remarkable, but what happened next would be discussed in intelligence briefings for months afterward. The second pair of fighters, seeing their leaders break off, maintained their attack trajectory, but shifted their focus from the bomber they had been assigned to the unexpected threat. Instead of continuing their carefully planned approach, they began taking evasive maneuvers while still trying to close the distance. This split attention between offense and defense created a fatal vulnerability. Henshaw adjusted his aim, walking his tracers through the air not to hit the fighters directly, but to force them into an increasingly narrow cone of approach. It was less like shooting at a target and more like herding animals through a gate, using the fear of the fire itself as a tool. Walsh, the front gunner, had been watching the engagement with mounting astonishment. Over the intercom, he reported that 2 more fighters were breaking off their attack runs, apparently unwilling to press through the sustained fire. This was unprecedented. German pilots had earned their reputation precisely because of their willingness to press attacks home regardless of defensive fire. But those attacks had always followed a predictable pattern. The defenders would wait, fire in controlled bursts, and the attackers would use speed and surprise to overwhelm them. Henshaw had changed the equation entirely. The continuous roar of the Brownings filled the bomber's fuselage with a sound like thunder compressed into a metal tube. Shell casings ejected in a steady stream, clattering against the turret floor. Henshaw's shoulders ached from the recoil, and his ears rang despite the leather helmet. But he maintained pressure on the triggers, sweeping his guns in controlled arcs that kept tracers streaming toward any fighter that attempted to close. He was burning through ammunition at a rate that would have horrified any gunnery instructor, but the effect was undeniable. The German formation, which should have pressed home coordinated attacks that would likely have resulted in at least 2 bombers taken down, was instead fragmenting, individual pilots making independent decisions about whether to brave the unexpected fire. Morrison, from his navigator's position, was frantically scribbling notes, trying to document what he was witnessing. He had studied military history at university and understood that he was watching something genuinely new, a tactical innovation born not from careful study or official experimentation, but from the desperate creativity of a sergeant who refused to die according to standard procedures. Over the intercom, he began calling out fighter positions, helping Henshaw track multiple threats simultaneously. The engagement had now lasted approximately 120 seconds, and the situation was developing in ways that defied every expectation. 3 of the German fighters had broken off entirely, diving away toward France. This was tactically unsound from their perspective. They had altitude advantage, numerical superiority, and aircraft performance that exceeded the bombers' capabilities. By every measure, they should have been able to execute their attacks successfully. But the sustained defensive fire, appearing at ranges where it should not have been possible, had created uncertainty and hesitation. And in aerial combat, hesitation measured in seconds could mean the difference between victory and defeat. A 4th fighter, more aggressive or perhaps more foolish than his companions, attempted to bull through the fire. He came in fast from the rear quarter, his Messerschmitt's distinctive nose and wing profile clearly visible to Henshaw. The gunner concentrated his fire, leading the target by what felt like an impossible distance. For several seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Tracers curved through the air. The fighter continued its approach, and Henshaw felt the sick certainty that he had gambled everything and was about to pay the price. Then, at approximately 450 yards, something extraordinary occurred. Whether through incredible luck, the sheer volume of fire, or some combination of both, rounds struck the fighter's engine cowling. Henshaw saw sparks, then a gout of black smoke, then the aircraft was tumbling, its pilot presumably fighting for control as the fighter fell away toward the channel far below. The intercom erupted with shouts from the crew. Chen's voice cut through the chaos, steady and focused. He confirmed the hit and instructed Henshaw to maintain his fire pattern. The other bombers in the formation, witnessing what was happening, began to break radio silence, their gunners asking for clarification on what they were seeing. The remaining 8 German fighters now faced a decision. Standard doctrine dictated that they should press their attacks, accepting losses to take down the bombers. But doctrine assumed defenders who behaved in predictable ways. The loss of one of their number to defensive fire at a range that should have been safe created a new calculation. Fighter pilots, no matter how brave or well-trained, were still human beings who wanted to survive. The risk-reward equation had shifted in ways their training had not prepared them for. Henshaw's ammunition counters showed that he had expended roughly 60% of his total load. If the engagement continued much longer, he would be defenseless. But something remarkable was happening. The German formation was dissolving. Individual pilots were making independent decisions to break off, diving away or climbing to reassess. The coordinated attack that should have overwhelmed the bomber formation was instead turning into a confused melee where the attackers seemed more concerned with avoiding defensive fire than pressing home their advantage. A second fighter made the fatal mistake of trying to maintain a steady approach trajectory while attempting to aim his weapons. Henshaw saw him coming, a textbook attack run that would have succeeded against any bomber following standard defensive procedures, but the continuous stream of tracers created a gauntlet that no pilot could ignore. At approximately 500 yards, the fighter pilot apparently made his decision to fire, and Henshaw saw the winking muzzle flashes from the fighter's nose-mounted cannons and wing guns. Rounds cracked past the Wellington, one punching through the fuselage just aft of the wing, but the fighter had fired while still maneuvering to avoid defensive fire, and his accuracy suffered accordingly. Henshaw did not try to dodge or take cover. He stood in his turret, hands locked on the gun controls, walking his tracers toward the approaching fighter. The mathematics of collision courses worked in his favor now. Every second the fighter closed meant the range decreased, which meant the probability of hits increased. At 370 yards, perhaps 360, the fighter flew directly into the stream of fire. The effect was catastrophic. The canopy shattered, the engine began trailing smoke, and the aircraft nosed over into a dive from which it would not recover. 2 down. The psychological impact on the remaining German pilots must have been extraordinary. They had lost 2 aircraft, not in turning dogfights where superior skill might prevail, but in straightforward attack runs where they had every advantage except one. They had expected defensive fire to behave in a certain way, and it had not. The remaining 6 fighters made passes at longer ranges, firing from positions that offered little chance of scoring critical hits, then breaking away before Henshaw's guns could track them effectively. They were still dangerous, but the initiative had shifted. The bombers, which should have been defending desperately against coordinated attacks, were instead watching enemy fighters make tentative, half-hearted approaches that suggested confusion and uncertainty. Chen made a tactical decision that demonstrated his own understanding of what was happening. Over the radio, he instructed the other bombers in the formation to have their gunners adopt the same technique. Open fire early, maintain sustained fire, force the attackers to make decisions before they were ready. The formation's defensive posture transformed within seconds. Instead of waiting for enemy fighters to close to lethal range, every gunner with a clear line of sight began firing, creating a 3-dimensional web of tracers that made any approach route a calculated risk. The results were immediate and dramatic. A third German fighter, attempting to make a high-side pass on one of the other bombers, flew into overlapping fire from 2 gunners and simply disintegrated, pieces of aircraft tumbling through the air as the pilot either perished or managed to escape via parachute. A fourth took hits to its wing root, the structure failing under the stress of high-speed maneuvering combined with battle damage, and it too fell away trailing debris. 4 down. What happened over the next 90 seconds would be analyzed by military tacticians for the remainder of the war and beyond. The remaining German fighters, facing an enemy that refused to behave according to established patterns, made a collective decision to disengage. Not retreat exactly, but a tactical withdrawal that acknowledged the engagement had not developed as expected. They dove away, using their superior speed to open the distance, and did not return. The bomber formation continued toward its target, having not only survived the attack, but having fundamentally disrupted the enemy's tactical approach. As the adrenaline began to fade, Henshaw's hands started shaking so badly that he had to release the gun controls and sit down on the small seat in his turret. He had expended nearly 75% of his ammunition. By every standard metric, this was a catastrophic failure of fire discipline. But 4 German fighters had been taken down in approximately 4 minutes of engagement, and the entire attack had been disrupted to the point where the enemy chose to withdraw despite having superior numbers and aircraft performance. The mathematics did not lie. Traditional defensive tactics had resulted in bomber loss rates of over 30% on some missions. This engagement had resulted in 0 bombers lost and a kill ratio that was simply unprecedented for defensive gunnery. Morrison was still scribbling notes, his training as an educator overriding everything else. He understood that he was documenting something genuinely important, a moment where tactical innovation born from desperation had created results that would reshape doctrine. Over the intercom, he began asking Henshaw to describe exactly what he had been thinking, how he had made his firing decisions, what visual references he had used to track multiple targets. The gunner, still trembling from the aftermath of combat, tried to articulate what had been largely instinctive, a combination of mathematics, psychology, and sheer determination not to die passively. Chen brought the Wellington around on its bombing run, the formation having achieved its tactical objective despite the fighter attack. The bombs fell away toward their targets, and the aircraft turned for home. During the return flight, the radio channels buzzed with conversation as crews tried to process what had happened. The skeptics, and there were many, argued that the engagement had been a fluke, that expending ammunition at such rates was unsustainable, that Henshaw had simply been extraordinarily lucky. The believers, and their numbers grew as the crews discussed the engagement, pointed out that luck did not account for a systematic disruption of enemy tactics and a kill ratio that exceeded anything achieved through conventional defensive fire. Upon landing at their base in eastern England, the crews were met by intelligence officers who had already received preliminary reports of the engagement. The debriefing lasted hours, with Henshaw being questioned in minute detail about his tactics, his decision-making process, and the observed results. Some senior officers were openly skeptical, suggesting that the young sergeant had merely wasted ammunition and endangered his aircraft. Others recognized that something significant had occurred, even if it challenged their assumptions about aerial combat. Over the following weeks, the engagement was studied, analyzed, and debated at every level of Royal Air Force Command. Test firings were conducted at ranges to determine actual hit probabilities at extended distances. The numbers confirmed what everyone already knew. The chances of hitting a maneuvering fighter at 800 yards with manually aimed guns were minuscule, probably less than 1%. But the additional analysis revealed something the traditional doctrine had overlooked. While the probability of a hit on any individual round was tiny, the sustained volume of fire increased the cumulative probability to levels that were tactically significant. More importantly, the psychological impact of sustained fire at unexpected ranges could not be quantified in simple ballistics calculations, but the results spoke for themselves. Flight tests were conducted where fighter pilots were asked to make attack runs against bombers employing the new tactic. The results were illuminating. Pilots reported that the early fire created an immediate psychological pressure that affected their decision-making. The natural human instinct to avoid flying toward visible tracer fire conflicted with the tactical requirement to press attacks home. This cognitive dissonance, occurring in the high-stress environment of aerial combat, led to hesitation, imperfect attack angles, and rushed firing solutions, all of which increased bomber survival rates. The tactical innovation that became known as the Henshaw method spread rapidly through bomber command. Gunnery instructors, initially resistant to abandoning established doctrine, began incorporating elements of sustained fire tactics into their training programs. Ammunition loads were recalculated to support higher expenditure rates. Turret designs were modified to improve heat dissipation during sustained fire. Crucially, the change in tactics was accompanied by a change in mindset. Gunners were no longer taught to think of themselves as passive defenders waiting to react to enemy attacks. Instead, they were encouraged to see themselves as active participants in disrupting enemy tactics through psychological and suppressive fire. The long-term impact on bomber survival rates was significant and measurable. In the months following the widespread adoption of sustained fire tactics, bomber losses to fighter attacks decreased by approximately 18%. This translated to hundreds of aircraft and thousands of crew members who survived missions they statistically should not have survived. The German Air Force adapted, developing new attack profiles and tactics designed to minimize exposure to defensive fire. But they never fully regained the tactical certainty they had enjoyed when they could predict exactly when and how bomber gunners would engage. Henshaw himself continued flying operations until March of 1942, completing a total of 47 missions, an extraordinary number for a rear gunner during that period. He survived the war and returned to Manchester, where he worked as a machinist in a factory that manufactured textile equipment. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, and most of his neighbors never knew that the quiet man who lived on their street had fundamentally changed the way aerial combat was conducted. Military historians who tracked him down decades later found him reluctant to accept credit for what he called a necessary improvisation rather than a brilliant innovation. Chen received a Distinguished Flying Cross for his leadership during the engagement and his willingness to authorize unconventional tactics. He completed his tour of operations and was transferred to a training command, where he spent the remainder of the war teaching young pilots the mathematics of aerial combat. After the war, he returned to academic life, eventually becoming a professor of applied mathematics at Oxford University. In his later years, he would occasionally lecture on decision-making under uncertainty, often using the August 15th engagement as a case study in how rigid adherence to doctrine could be overcome by creative thinking grounded in sound analytical principles. Morrison's detailed notes from the engagement became part of the official Royal Air Force historical record and were studied by researchers for decades afterward. He survived the war and returned to teaching, eventually becoming headmaster of a grammar school in Scotland. He maintained a lifelong correspondence with Henshaw and Chen, the three men bound by their shared experience of the day when desperation and innovation had combined to challenge the certainties of aerial combat doctrine. Walsh, the front gunner who had initially dismissed Henshaw's plan as suicidal, became one of the most vocal advocates for sustained fire tactics in the months following the engagement. He trained dozens of new gunners in the techniques and psychological approach that made the tactic effective. He completed 31 operational missions before being seriously wounded during a raid over Germany in March of 1941. He recovered sufficiently to serve in training roles for the remainder of the war, and afterward became an advocate for veterans' causes, working to ensure that the contributions of aircrew members were properly recognized and honored. The German pilots who survived the engagement also had their own reckonings with what had occurred. Luftwaffe intelligence officers debriefed them extensively, trying to understand why an attack that should have succeeded had instead resulted in such significant losses. The pilots described the unexpected defensive fire, the psychological impact of sustained tracers at extended ranges, and the tactical confusion that had resulted. German tactical doctrine was modified to emphasize faster attack runs with less time spent in the defender's firing zone, but these adaptations came at a cost. The rushed attacks reduced accuracy and overall effectiveness, creating a tactical arms race where each side's adaptations drove further changes on the other side. The broader lesson of the engagement extended far beyond the specific techniques of aerial gunnery. It demonstrated that tactical innovation often comes not from established experts comfortable with existing doctrine, but from individuals willing to question assumptions when those assumptions led to predictable negative outcomes. Henshaw had not been a brilliant tactician or a trained military theorist. He had been a frightened young man who recognized that following the rules meant death and who was desperate enough to try something different. The fact that his improvisation worked was partly luck, but it was luck built on a foundation of observation, analysis, and the courage to act on unconventional ideas. Military institutions, by their nature, value standardization and doctrine. These provide crucial frameworks for coordinating complex operations and ensuring consistent performance across large organizations. But history repeatedly demonstrates that victories often come from those who recognize when doctrine has become disconnected from reality and who possess the creativity and courage to devise new approaches. The challenge for any military organization is to create space for this kind of innovation, while maintaining the discipline necessary for effective operations. The Royal Air Force's relatively rapid adoption of Henshaw's tactics demonstrated an institutional willingness to learn from practical experience, even when that experience challenged established wisdom. The engagement over the English Channel on August 15, 1940, also highlighted the complex psychology of aerial combat. The German pilots who faced Henshaw's sustained fire were not cowards. They were experienced, skilled aviators who had proven their courage in dozens of previous engagements. But courage exists within a framework of expectations and calculations. When those expectations are violated, when the familiar pattern of combat is disrupted by something unexpected, even brave individuals must make rapid recalculations about risk and reward. The sustained defensive fire created a psychological environment where the cost-benefit analysis of pressing attacks home shifted dramatically. This was not about superior technology or better training. It was about disrupting the enemy's mental model of how combat should unfold. Decades after the war ended, military analysts studying the engagement identified it as an early example of what would later be called asymmetric tactics, where a force with apparent disadvantages uses unexpected approaches to negate an enemy's strengths. The Wellington bombers could not outrun or outmaneuver the German fighters. In a traditional engagement following standard doctrine, the fighters held every advantage. But by changing the rules of engagement, by introducing uncertainty and psychological pressure, at unexpected moments the defenders created conditions where their weaknesses mattered less and their limited advantages, specifically the ability to concentrate sustained fire at ranges where attackers did not expect it, became tactically decisive. The story of that August morning also serves as a reminder that individual initiative and courage can have impacts far beyond what any single person might anticipate. Henshaw had not set out to revolutionize aerial combat doctrine. He had simply wanted to survive. And he had been willing to try something different to achieve that goal. The fact that his desperate improvisation became a widely adopted tactic that saved thousands of lives was not something he could have predicted or planned. It emerged from his willingness to question authority, to trust his own observations and reasoning, and to accept the risks inherent in doing something radically different from what everyone else considered proper and correct. In the final analysis, the engagement that resulted in 12 German fighters being disrupted and 4 taken down in approximately 4 minutes represented a convergence of factors that only rarely align in military history. It required an individual willing to question doctrine, a commander willing to authorize unconventional approaches, a crew willing to trust their comrades' judgment, and circumstances that allowed the innovation to demonstrate its effectiveness clearly enough that institutional resistance could be overcome. Remove any one of these elements, and the engagement might have been just another forgotten skirmish in a war full of desperate battles and narrow escapes. Instead, it became a case study in tactical innovation, a demonstration that the human capacity for creative problem-solving can sometimes overcome apparent technological and numerical disadvantages. The young sergeant from Manchester, who decided to ignore his training and trust his instincts, did not know he was making history. He simply knew that the old way of doing things was not working, and that survival required something different. That simple realization, acted upon with determination and courage, changed the mathematics of aerial combat and saved countless lives in the years that followed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.